Welcome back, folks. We're on to Chapter 13, Political Participation. And here are our learning outcomes for the week. We'll outline Milbrath and Gold's analysis of political participation. We'll discuss why people do or do not participate in democracies. We'll identify privileged social groups that dominate political participation and those that are underrepresented. And we'll identify forms of public opinion measurement and their strengths and weaknesses. Our conversation this week is going to center around who participates and why. Political participation is a pretty straightforward concept. We're talking about the actions of individuals and that are taken to influence both who governs and ultimately the decisions that they make. Conventional forms of political participation are also very straightforward. We're talking about voting, writing letters to the editor, giving a speech on a political issue that you care about. These would be political actions that are taken very much within the systems of formal politics and the law. Unconventional political participation, it could be lawful, it could be unlawful. Lawful examples might be, boycotting products if that company takes a position that you don't agree with. Maybe they have a harsh environmental practices and people choose to boycott their products. It could be, massive demonstrations. And then in some situations, unconventional participation might even be unlawful. A recent example is tearing down the statues of Confederate leaders. Certainly that's a form of political participation. It's making a political statement that we should not be celebrating people that were effectively traitors to the United States of America and turned against the United States of America. Still, on its face, that is patently unlawful behavior, that is to tear down a public statue without going through a process to remove that statue. So that'd be a form of unconventional participation. Another thing to consider this week is the concept of the paradox of participation. Voting is the most basic form of political participation. Some might consider an irrational act given the time and effort involved to learn the issues and to make an informed vote. And the fact that there's a very slim chance that vote is going to be the one that makes all the difference. And yet, collectively, if we don't vote and we don't make decisions as informed citizens, we are going to have, terrible leaders and we're going to have terrible public policy. So, I know we've explored this a little bit before, but voting itself is a collective action dilemma. How do you get people together to make informed decisions? And if we don't do that, our public policy and our leadership is certainly going to suffer. Political exclusion is also an important concept. And all democracies exclude certain people from political action and political participation. Participation in most established democracies is skewed toward well-educated, middle-class, middle-aged white men. They hold many of the leadership posts. They're much more likely to vote, tend to have more resources. Women vote at a very high level in most democracies and in the United States, and yet hold only between 15 and 20% of the world's legislative positions. And although we are seeing more and more women as prime ministers and as the top executives in their country, it is still the minority. Political exclusion also in many cases is linked to social exclusion. So folks like migrant workers, prisoners, people who do not speak the language, these folks are often excluded. And of course, we make a lot of decisions about who should participate and not. We don't allow 8-year-olds to vote in elections. We exclude those people who are under 18 in the United States. The voting age varies from country to country. As I just stated before, the United States makes the decision to not allow people who are currently in prison to vote in many states. And in some states, they don't allow people who, even after they have served and paid their debt to the society, to participate. So, these are questions that we need to have, which is who should be excluded and why. Here's a good overview of Milbrath and Gold's 1977 analysis of who participates. And in their study, they found, looking at those participating in American politics, that about 5 to 7% of the population fell into the category they called gladiators. They fight the political battles. They run for office. They're engaged in advocacy. They're lobbying. They're raising money. They're the foot soldiers that we see when it comes to American politics. The majority, according to Milbrath and Gold, are in our system and in many democracies are spectators. They watch political developments, but the only direct participation they engage in is through voting. And that's about 60% of the overall population. And then about a third of the population are apathetics. They're not engaged. Again, to take this metaphor even further, they're not on the field. They're not in the stands. They're not even in the parking lot. They're just simply not engaged in the political process. And there's a lot of reasons for this. And, as we explored before, it takes time and energy to both vote and be a knowledgeable participant in elections. If you're working 3 jobs and you're, have children and you're taking public transportation to manage your varying responsibilities, then probably voting in an election isn't going to be real high on your list. However, if you have resources and you have the flexibility in your time, that opens up opportunities to run for office and to fight the political battles that you care about. Public opinion is an important Public opinion obviously influences political participation, and for that reason it's important that we measure public opinion. It influences consumer politics, buying or boycotting goods or services for ethical or political reasons. Some ways that we gather this information, well, around elections, you're probably all very familiar with scientific public opinion polls, where a sample is gathered of, for example, eligible voters. They are gathered randomly in a way that any eligible voter that you're trying to measure, could be Minnesota voters, anybody who's in that population that you want to study has an equal chance of being selected for that. And by just interviewing 1,000 people, you can project that onto the larger population, especially if the opinion poll is done well. Certainly around elections, we see a great deal of these. There are also great limitations. So in many cases, the margin of error on a public opinion poll, a national public opinion poll, might be plus or minus 3 percentage points. And so that means that if somebody is slightly ahead in that opinion poll, if they're only 1 or 2 percentage points ahead, you don't really know who is the favored candidate in that situation. So there really are limits to public opinion poll. And I think a lot of times, in terms of how opinion polling is portrayed in the media, they'll indicate that one candidate or the other is ahead, when actually the poll is not precise enough to determine that. Another way that information is gathered is through focus groups, and maybe you've been part of a focus group. It's a moderated discussion with a small group of people on a particular topic, and that could be about a consumer product. They could be testing a new type of breakfast cereal, and they want to hear what a group of people think about it. Or they could be testing political language and slogans and how those make people feel. Do they inspire them? Do they motivate them? Do they turn them off of the particular candidate? So focus groups are used to really get a lot more information, but it's really difficult in focus groups to project that out, to generalize based on the information you get on focus groups. It's really hard to say, well, we had this focus group and therefore the American people feel this way. It's very difficult to do that. However, you can get very detailed information from individual participants on how language makes them feel or how they feel about a particular product. As I just stated, there are real limitations to public opinion polling. The first is that they don't offer detailed policy prescriptions to decision makers. So people might be in favor of expanded healthcare, universal healthcare, but the devil's in the details. What kind of plan do we provide? The public as a whole can be ill-informed, and the public as a whole and public opinion can evade or not recognize trade-offs. So In many cases, you'll see people who want more generous programs like Social Security or Medicare, but also at the same time might want lower taxation. So that would be an example of they want to raise less revenue for the government, but they also want more generous programs. Public opinion can evade that trade-off, but decision makers cannot. They have to deal with both of those. And then the idea behind public opinion, gathering public opinion, is it allows voters to bypass the media and take their message directly to decision makers. So there's a real democratic component to this, but politicians may have warped perceptions about what public opinion is because they're influenced by their own personal contacts. They're surrounded by their own supporters. If they go to rallies, it's only going to be people that support their position. So in many cases, they're just simply unaware of what the wider electorate thinks, especially if they don't know how to interpret public opinion polling, as many leaders don't. As I mentioned before, women hold between 15 and 20% of legislative elected positions globally, and an even lower percentage of executive positions. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Spend time in your reading exploring them. But real briefly, some men, there's still an undercurrent of sexism when it comes to voting, and many men are still not ready to vote women into high office. Women face more obstacles when it comes to raising money, in part for the reason I just mentioned. Women are much less likely to think that they're qualified to run, and so perhaps if they don't have as extensive as a resume in politics or related training, they might think that they're not able to run this. I'm sure we could drill into the cultural components of this, whereas men are much more likely to overestimate their experience and their qualifications to run, even if they might not have relevant experience to the position that they're seeking. Of course, some countries, women are barred from running, or it's much more difficult, particularly in the Middle East. This all gets into the concept of gendered institutions that have formal rules and convention which advantage men over women. Even in the United States, you'll have situations where something as simple as accessing a women's restroom is historically much more difficult in institutions that were designed for men. There may be fewer, or they may be farther apart. That might seem like a small thing, but to what extent are these institutions governed and directed by women and for women? That makes a big difference. A chart from your text that kind of goes over some of the data that we just explored. You see that there's quite a wide range of the level of participation in national legislatures. There are also some extremely prominent women in executive posts, Angela Merkel from Germany being one example, who serves as a chancellor there. But as stated earlier, women serve an even lower percentage when it comes to executive positions around the globe. In most authoritarian states, there's not government action to control people's lives on a day-to-day basis. It's really only those extreme totalitarian states like North Korea where you see those kind of efforts take place. However, when it comes to political participation, there's a much greater interest by authoritarian governments to limit and control political participation. They see themselves as having a monopoly of power in this area. If you stay out of politics, you'll be left alone. But once you start to enter the political realm, that's when you get much more scrutiny. So some things that we tend to see when it comes to political participation in authoritarian states are clientelism, which is politics based on a patron-client relationship. A power figure would be the patron, provides protection, might even provide some levels of support or subsidy, food, fuel, things like this to much lower status clients in return for their unqualified support. So we see this, we saw this in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, where, there'll be subsidized gasoline. We saw this in Cuba under the Castro regime. Access to, basic foodstuffs, things like this to support lower status citizens in exchange for their unqualified political support. You will also see, and particularly in more totalitarian regime, mobilized public opinion, where there's an effort by the dictatorship to demonstrate their power by mobilizing mass demonstrations that are in support of themselves. You'll see this in China, you'll see this in North Korea, where there are literally millions of people who are demonstrating in unison in support of the authoritarian or totalitarian regime. That would be an example of mobilized public opinion or mobilized participation. And as has been explored throughout the course, countries do not fall into neat little boxes. Many are hybrid systems that combine democratic and authoritarian elements. And that's also the case when it comes to political participation. They're not going to fall neatly into these categories. I think this graph from your textbook does a good job illustrating that. So to pull things together, we know quite a bit about who does and does not participate in democracies, but the reason behind political participation and the level of political participation varies quite a bit. We know that studies of participation in democracies show a bias toward privileged social groups, reflecting inequalities of both resources and education. Political participation seems to be declining globally in terms of voting and in terms of traditional forms of political participation. But that might be a little bit misleading because people are choosing a wider variety of ways to express themselves, and that could be through boycotts, through demonstrations, through social media, things like that. The science of measured public opinion polling has improved dramatically, but there are still technological challenges and imperfections, and there are limitations of public opinion polling that we have to accept. They do a good job addressing about what issues people care about. They're not really good when it comes to coming up with specific solutions, and when it comes to measuring support for specific political candidates, we have to recognize that in very close races and elections, they may fall within the margin of error in that particular public opinion poll, and therefore not be able to give you really a clear indication of what's likely to occur. Political engagement by women has increased substantially, both in terms of voter turnout and other forms of participation, but we still see a lot of inequality when it comes to access to positions of power, legislative races or legislative positions globally, certainly executive positions. Women tend to be much more involved in local political positions like city council, school board, those sort of things. But when it starts to go to larger and more important regional positions and certainly national positions, they tend to be underrepresented. In authoritarian regimes, clientelism and mobilized participation, they're both important concepts to understand. That in many cases public opinion is either discouraged or forced. And measuring public opinion can be quite difficult because people are concerned how that information is being gathered and whether or not that information is going to be shared with the authoritarian leadership. Okay, here are your guiding questions for the week. 1 substantial original post and at least 2 responses to your classmates' on-topic post to get a perfect score for the week. As I mentioned before, make sure that you're tying in examples, quotes from assigned reading that support and inform your position. We're getting near toward the end of the class, so please reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns. Of course, I have my Zoom office hours. Post your questions, shoot me an email, and have a fantastic week.